Aloha and welcome to your weekly online retreat. My name is Amber Kuileimailani Bonnici, and I'm here today with our guide, Kelly. Aloha, Kelly.
Hi, Amber. Lovely to be here.
So nice to have Kelly here with us today. Today we are talking habit, and we're talking about how to shift habit, and maybe in ways that you haven't really thought of before. And so we're going to dive in. Make sure that you have your Womanly journal, that you have a space that you can be very comfortable in, and if you have an altar table, a place that you do your practice, that bring us over there. That's where we're gonna do our most powerful work today. So before we do that, let's get present and grounded. So I'm inviting you with me to close your eyes and first noticing if there's any lingering energy or things from earlier in the past that is pulling your attention. Let's come to this moment. Inhale in. Exhale, release that. Next, noticing if there's anything in the future that you're worried about or thinking about that's, again, pulling you away from this moment. Come back here. Inhale in. Exhale, release. And our third and final breath together, smelling this moment. Nowhere else to be, nothing else to do. And when you're ready, exhale, release. And inviting you to open your eyes so I can introduce you to our guide today. So Kelly, Kelly and I know each other. We're mastermind buddies, but I really wanted to bring her on. We've had her on as a Womanly guide before, but she's got some really juicy things. She's taps you into purpose, into meditation. She helps you tune inwards, and we're going to be doing some of that today. But Kelly, is it blazer or blazer, Kelly?
Blazer.
Blazer.
Mm-hmm.
Like the blazers we wear. So Kelly Blazer, she's the founder of Dharma Bridge. And so she is the founder of that, as well as she's a yoga and meditation teacher and a marriage family therapist. So she kind of bridges it and brings it all together. So she is really about, kind of a somatic transpersonal approach. So, being in your body, and she takes creativity as well into her work with her clients and students. Isn't she perfect for us, right? So she has an academic and applied background in Buddhist psychology. She's specialized in the application of non-dual tantric teachings to her practice. She's worked with couples and families and individuals for over 2 decades and really navigating, the complexities of relationships, including how to be in a relationship with yourself. So including like all of those things that she does, we get her today. And, when Kelly and I were first talking, we're like, what would be something juicy for our people? And we started really looking at the power of habit, right? And more importantly, why, have you ever had a habit where it's like you want to change it and you can't change it, right? It's like you try and it's like you're good for a little bit and it's like, back to same old, right? And so today we're talking about habit and how to start to shift that. Finally, welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, Amber. It's great to be here. Yes, I think there's a real paradox in the process of transforming habits. And I think that the tricky thing for a lot of people is they've sort of given up on themselves around changing habits because they've tried so many times in the past and it's been a flop, And so that we tend to not really even muster much energy for it. There's certainly not generally a lot of joy around the project. And I think that the paradox of habit change is that things actually shift when we enter into a place of this adoration of things as they actually are. So, if you could kind of step back from whatever the issue is that continually kind of vexes you or gets in the way of you actualizing what you want to do in the world or how you want to be in the world, if you could step back and kind of take a big, bird's eye view, but a bird's eye view that's not just about getting space, physical space, stepping away from it and seeing it from further away, but actually seeing it beyond the confines of time and looking at your whole life and how you're, for a lot of the habits that people really struggle with, it feels like they've been around since the very beginning. Like if you have an addiction of some sort, probably the roots of that were in some kind of dissociation that happened when you were really little, like maybe it was like tater tots on the TV, or maybe it was, craving, like feeling like you didn't have enough, whatever, there's these roots are really, they arise when we're pre-verbal, pre-cognitive, so it's kind of hard to get in there and actually create a change that's deep enough that it will actually be sustainable, and when we're in relationship with an inspiring mentor or guide, which, if those of you that are listening, like you're kind of, riding the wings of Woman Unleashed and the power of the community, the Sangha, and the love that Amber shares so bountifully throughout the world, that can really help, can be hugely transformative. And I think that we can even go, even if you don't have that support, I should just say, it's always better to have support. It always works better if you have support. But for anyone listening, like if you do not have support and you can't figure out how to get yourself into community, you can still stretch yourself out and look, like just for a moment, look at your whole life and imagine your whole self throughout the whole of time, and exactly the way that this particular habit has distressed you, what its roots feel like. And see if you can come to this point of kind of almost like a crucible. Like, would I do it all over again with this habit? And I think when you can come to that point with enough kind of adoration for the whole self and the innocence really of the child, which is hopefully what you get in touch with when you look at it from this perspective, that's, I think that's like the crux move. So for me, like paradoxically, the habits that were troubling for me in my youth, letting go of them has always been about getting to a point where I'm like, okay, if this is what I live with for the rest of my life, I'm okay. I'll do it anyway.
This is so interesting because this is like when I think of when I was younger, people were looking for their person, their partner, right? It was always like, it wasn't when you were looking for them. It was when you were like, no, I'm good. I don't need anyone, right? Or I think about, for me, when I lost weight, like after my babies, I put on probably 30 pounds. And I tried all sorts of things to lose the weight. And, when I finally did it from a place of love, of like, you know what, I really want to be like, but loving my body right where it was, instead of like beating myself up of like, I'm not good enough, I'm not thin enough. Like, that's when I lost the weight. It wasn't when I was in a place of like self-hatred and how I wasn't good, like all that thing. So I love this conversation of, it's something like it opens up space when like that is normally taken up by whatever that conversation normally is of self-beating up or not good enough, or, it's the lack, the scarcity. Yeah.
Yeah. And the self-criticism, like the operative word in self-criticism is self, it's this kind of consumption with the entity of the separate self. And this gets a little bit like, I'm definitely going sort of Buddhist psychology here, but I think that any kind of a practice, and I know a lot of your people are artists, and I consider art and meditation to be like two wings of a gracefully flying spiritual practice, like that's really the classic combination. But in any kind of a practice, the first move would be to take refuge, which really means like coming into a remembrance of the fact that your deepest essence is primordial awakeness, and that's the deepest essence of all beings. And that is, in a sense, it's not a right, but it is an opportunity for all beings to awaken to that. And then once you're sort of in this sense of there's nothing that is more fundamentally who I am than primordial awakeness. And there's nothing more fundamentally what anyone is but this incredible light of awareness itself. Then there's like much less kind of self-orientation. It's like we just all rise from this deep source of love, essentially. And an awakeness and the desire to kind of play through these individuated forms, but as spirit, as life force. And then when you orient that way, then like self, like the orientation around self and wanting to improve upon the self by changing the habits, it just kind of seems a little bit petty, you know, and you're sort of, it starts to look a little bit humorous, the whole affair, you know. And so any of the despair that you might have around, oh, I've tried really hard to shift habits in the past and I haven't really been able to, that despair gets much, like it almost becomes kind of comical. It's like, well, yeah, honey, of course it didn't work, because the way you were approaching it was completely about trying to improve upon this beautiful self that you weren't even fully into, you weren't grokking, you know? So I feel like it's, you know, the main ingredient is like grokking the mystery and the luminosity that is your deepest nature, and actually bringing in this kind of adoration for this life force as it runs through me, and this curiosity. And you know, for artists, there's like, I mean, there's no better place to turn than art, because, you know, you watch what your hand does and you're like, what? Like, what is that? Like, that's incredible. Or like, what is that? Like, I decided blue. What made blue drop in as an option right now? Like, why not red? We don't know. It's a mystery. Like, it's crazy, right? You just, and every moment of life is actually that way. And it's this co-creation, and that's actually a really big thing in the tantric teachings, is, and I'm talking about classical tantra, not so much like neo-tantra, for those of you that know the distinction. But in the classical tantric teachings, there's this understanding that like the world that we perceive, it's not a projection just of your own mind. Like, that's kind of a common concept, you know, like especially from Advaita Vedanta and other traditions, like the world is just arising out of your own awareness. Maybe, but from the tantric teachings, it's a co-creation. Like, my capacity to perceive and your capacity to perceive are actually merging into this like kaleidoscopic phantasm of creativity, and it is just such a trip. So when you can be curious and in adoration of that, then, and at the same time accept that, like, at the level of the conditioned self, there's going to be some kind of lingering feeling of discord, you know, because that's what the conditioned self does. It gets caught in the brokenness. It gets caught in the pain of, you know, whatever you've lived through. And, you know, if there's been a really strong kind of current of trauma that's run through your lineage, like that stuff can get really intense. So I don't mean to downplay or like minimize that. It's not that it's not real, but I think that the only way to address it is really like through this, taking this bigger view.
Okay. So so I get it. And it's like, well, how do we do that? Right. It's like nice to be like, okay, let's live in a state of wonder and curiosity. It's like, yeah, okay, but how do we do that? Right. So let's bring it down to like, how can we actually, like, what are the practices to help cultivate that? Because those are all like, we hear about, you know, being in wonder, being in gratitude, being in those spaces. And it's like, okay, now let's, like, where's the rubber meet the road? And I know you've got practices to help us do that, to help us like move into that space so that we're not in a place of beating ourselves up as much. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, so there's a thing in trauma work, it's called titration. And it's kind of about like easing up against the dark spots and kind of like creating a contrast inside. And we could do that, but because you and I talked about this positive shadow work, well, first of all, for anyone who's like, yeah, answer Amber's question, because I need to know that. I guess I want to say, with a free gift that I'm going to be giving you guys is around shadow, and shadow is usually, it is like how to deal with that really dark stuff that lurks underneath the level of consciousness that we don't know how to deal with. So you will get some tools there, but I really want to work with you around this idea of positive shadow. So positive shadow, I think, is super important for women, primarily because, like, let's face it, like we didn't have enough guides of really powerful women who are holding. I mean, all women are powerful. Let me just back up. All women are so powerful and really are, like, in so many ways running this world, you know, but we've often not been given and not been shown enough examples of women who are like really powerful in always expressing what they really truly feel, or taking up a lot of space, or stretching ourselves to like handle more responsibility in the world, or financial power, you know, running big companies, or even just like the simple things like having boundaries around our personal practice. I mean, one of the reasons I think that people struggle so much with the idea of practice is because most women are like, yeah, I've got 2 little kids. I mean, now I'm just talking about myself. Like I have a 6-year-old and 8-year-old, like they wake me up at 5, like coughing, or they, whatever, like had a bad dream. Like how am I going to prioritize myself? But the truth is, like, it's just that we haven't had a good template for how to prioritize one's own journey, you know? And so I think it's really important for women to do this positive shadow work, which is, it's similarly like a little bit of a titration process. So titration comes from chemistry, and it's this idea of like, you could have like a beaker of one solution. And if you're not sure, like, I don't know that much about chemistry actually, but like, you know, like if I were to say there's 2 substances that if I poured them together into a beaker, it would create a massive explosion. I can't do that, right? So what I can do is I can put 1 drop at a time in, and I can observe what happens with 1 drop at a time. So with positive shadow work, what we're doing is we're looking at the stuff that lives underneath the level of consciousness that's actually our deepest light. You know, I mean, it's hard not to quote that really important poem around it is what is it? It's like, it's our deepest light that terrifies us the most. Do you know it?
Yeah, the Marianne Williamson quote, it's not our shadow, but our, as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give others the right to do the same.
Yeah, the permission to do so. So it's obviously like, there is a trickle effect. There's a ripple effect when we are able to let our own light shine, but we are usually timid around doing that. So this shadow meditation this positive shadow meditation will be all about kind of dropping into the place where your brilliance lives, and like easing up against it, and then dealing with the fact that you probably got shamed around that power in some way. And so kind of getting into connection with the brilliance, and then getting into connection with the shame, and then giving yourself kind of this infusion of loving kindness. So it's a little bit of mental acrobatics, you know? I mean, to be perfectly honest, like, we're not just sitting and breathing. There's lots of practices where we just sit, or where we direct the breath in a very specific way. But this is a little bit like using the imaginal realm to concoct an inner environment where we can bring these kind of energies up against each other. So should we dive in? Is it time?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay.
Let's get our meditation on, ladies.
All right. So I think it's really important when you're meditating to be comfortable. And there's a lot of value in being seated upright with your spine long. But if that's not comfortable for you, then you should lay down or do whatever you need to do. Just fix my cushion. Okay, and so I'm hoping that you're at your altar. And if you are not at your altar, maybe you can just bring maybe you're traveling or something, but maybe you can bring your recollection of what your altar looks like into your space. And if not, then you can also think of the heart center as the ultimate altar. And drop your awareness into your body and into the heart center, sometimes called the seat of consciousness, where we really can recollect this primordial awakeness that is our deepest nature, and where we can recollect that that is something that we all share. So just breathe there for a moment and remember your intention. And sometimes that's just about asking yourself what you are seeking. And as my teacher used to say, that which you are seeking is causing you to seek. So as soon as you just inquire into the deepest self. What are you seeking? Then you're already in touch with that willingness to seek that arises from the deepest source. So breathe there into the heart. Touching into this kind of earnest, sincere care for yourself and for ultimately all of life. And some of you might be familiar with this practice called metta, loving kindness, which is basically a way of coming home to oneself. Basically a way of getting honest about the different ways that you have perhaps abandoned yourself along the road over the years, and kind of exerting a sort of willingness, finding a new willingness to come closer into connection with who you actually are, and a willingness to hold yourself with compassion and loving kindness. And if you can't get yourself there, reflect for a moment on what the cost is of not making that shift. And then ask yourself again, what am I seeking? And again, send this message to yourself of loving kindness, compassion. You might actually use the metta phrases. May I be safe. May I be happy. May I be free from suffering. May I be filled with loving kindness. And take a moment to let that sink in. And I want you to kind of walk back through the hollowed halls of your history, drawing up any recollection you might have of yourself as a child. And if you can tap into some memory of when you felt really big in the world, that's really helpful. So see if you can find a recollection of feeling really free, feeling overwhelming exuberance, maybe a moment where you wanted to be on stage, maybe a moment where you wanted to perform, where you wanted to dance, where you wanted to be seen. Or if you were more introverted, even just a way that you knew what a marvel you were, where you kind of let in the awesomeness of who you were. And as you feel into that, no matter what it brings up for you, remember that that is just an expression of your primordial awakeness playing in the world. And feel the energy of the compassion, the loving kindness, the joy, and even the equanimity. So there's a feeling of kind of steadiness as you perceive that exuberance. And then if it comes up for you, or if you can find one of these moments, I want you to look into Any moment where you felt like you got shut down by the world. Either you felt shamed or heckled or embarrassed, or you felt like you had to draw back. Any way that you kind of pulled the covering over yourself. And I want you to send loving kindness toward that part of yourself that pulled you back. And send loving kindness toward that part of yourself that was simply feeling the purity of her own freedom, her own brilliance. Breathe. Try to feel it in your body right now. You're touching down into these deep, raw moments where the real truth of who you are, who you were, and who you always will be got squelched in some way. And we're sending loving kindness to the one who was squelched. But we're not vilifying the one who participated in the squelching. Send loving kindness into the whole system. Send loving kindness, send compassion, send equanimity, send empathetic joy, exuberance into the whole system of your own psyche, your own spirit. And then see if you can experience yourself as a mentor for these parts of yourself. The one that is joy unchecked, and the one that is tangled up in fear. Feel yourself a loving presence, pure awareness, filled with loving kindness, holding the whole spectacle in loving awareness. And if you are a visual person, I want you to imagine that the brilliant one that you are stands up, lifts her arms up to the sun, opens herself up to the light. And without any rancor toward the part of the self that shut her down, walks forward into the world. And feel that energy that really is the energy of the deepest source moving through you, as you, for you. And then when you're ready, gently open your eyes. To bring yourself back. And if anything came to mind that surprised you, jot it down if you have a journal. And if in particular you saw anything, I know because many of you are artists, you probably are really visual. If you saw anything, then let it come onto the page in whatever form it wants to show up. So maybe the relationship between this brilliant young part of yourself and the part of yourself that had a lot of fear and whose fear got stimulated by maybe the fear of society at large, or other children who were harsh or cruel or what have you, or maybe a caregiver that didn't seem to be particularly grounded or have anyone's best interest at heart. Now see what came up. And it can be useful, and this goes a bit deeper. We don't really have time to do a full kind of expose here, but it can be really useful to actually give the different energies that arose, the different characters that arose, to give them names. Almost like you're writing a play. You might even write down, like you might just be curious, like what did that part of myself that tried to shame the brilliant part of myself, what was it afraid of? What was that conditioned part of myself afraid of? And what did it say? What does it say? In many cases, these conversations are still very alive. And then as you connect into the experience that the child has, I say has in present tense very consciously because the child is still alive, you just ask her, what does she want? Does she want to be adored? Does she want to be celebrated? Does she want to decorate? Does she want to color? What does she want? And sometimes this stuff doesn't show up right away, you know. Sometimes it's like we just give a little suggestion to the unconscious to you know, that we're listening, that we're paying attention. Sometimes the unconscious is kind of like, no, I'm not going for that. I'm not into it. You know, almost like they say that the divine kind of veils itself. There's this whole teaching around the mullahs, like the different ways that the heart kind of, the different ways that dust can show up on the heart from the classical tantra. And it's, you know, it's kind of like this game of hide and seek. Like the divine doesn't just show itself like utterly, and the unconscious is kind of this process of hide and seek. You know, I'm only going to show you this little bit. So I think it's really important to sort of look at the riddle when you do this kind of a process, and then look at what happens in the outer world when you kind of walk yourself out into your day, or notice what comes up in your dreams and investigate it like it's all a dream, you know. Investigate it like it's all a dream, and it's got this play going on, this riddle that it's telling me, but it's not going to tell it to me straight. I mean, it's a riddle. So just be kind of curious. They sometimes say like the divine speaks in twilight language. The goddess in particular speaks in twilight language and comes in the form of synchronicities and unexpected openings. So I would just encourage you guys to be interested and be playful and see what shows up in your artwork, and see what, you know, maybe if something does show up that gives you a little inkling that there's something there for you, if you can put it on your altar in some way, I think that's really useful. You know, and if anything that came through for you today felt really significant, in your awareness, see if you can kind of pair whatever that symbology was, kind of pair it with the project of loosening up the rigidity around habits and the conditioned desire to, you know, obliterate the habit. You know, see if you can like, almost like you're on a scavenger hunt through life, and you're just looking for, you're looking for random insights, and then, you know, let those random insights kind of influence the way that you're thinking around habits.
This has been so good. So ladies, we'd love for you to jump in the Facebook group and to share what came up for you during the meditation, if you had any ahas around that, and or even just ahas around the conversation around habit, and, you know, how you're being with yourself around habit. This was really interesting for me. Like, part of what came up for me is from my brilliant space, like the conversation of like, be humble, don't be too big or people won't like you, like don't take up too much space. Like that was when I went back, that was like the conversation that I was hearing. And I realized that I just recently said something like that to my son. I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. Yeah. Parenting is crazy, right? You see so much about how you're being with yourself through the way that
Yeah. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to have a conversation with him about that. Like, go for it. But just to watch my fear for him not being connected, like being isolated and alone, lonely, is directing like what I'm saying to him, so it's like watching that pattern play out. And so, yeah, this is juicy. So I feel like there's something there.
Yeah. Well, you know what's so cool about that, just briefly, is, certainly when we do our spiritual work, like we contribute to the healing of our offspring, no question about it. We contribute to at least we limit our capacity to do harm. But I also think that there's this interesting way where, like, we send the healing back up the river toward our ancestors. And I mean, I know that sounds super metaphysical, but trauma, like, just to go back to the trauma conversation, trauma gets carried through lineages and gets passed down in these ways where, even if we don't remember, we don't know what our mothers and grandmothers experienced, we can feel like the ways that their heads got put in vices. We can feel the way they clamped down on themselves, the way that they became rigid in the way that they perceived the world. And we don't have to think that that's just like a one-way street. We can send, and I don't know, I don't want to go into it too much because it would take too long, but there are practices around that as well.
So good. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it sounds woo, but there's so much teaching around it, like energy schools that teach around that, like, religion. I know the Bible, it talks about 7 generations. Like, there's so much that, like, the healing that we do, how it ripples in all directions. So here's to our healing and playing with this, the shadow, right? And playing with the shadow of what I liked that during the meditation, we looked at both, right? We looked at our brilliance, and then the conversation that was coming up against that, as well as, like, for me, the time when I wasn't, or when I was feeling isolated, right? So it was like looking at both sides of that to notice both sides of the spectrum. So can you share a little bit about your free gift? Because you mentioned it briefly about shadow work, but if you can share some about
Sure,
how they would benefit.
Yeah. So right now it's called Safe with Ourselves, and it's about liberating. What's the tagline? It's something like liberating positive shadow through the power of loving kindness. So kind of similar to what we just did, but it's there's first of all like a Dharma talk, like a talk about it, where I just kind of go into how I think our beliefs get constructed because of, or somewhat as a result of what's held in the shadows, and then how we can kind of loosen that all up. And there's a meditation in there as well, and then some other resources. So yeah.
Awesome. So if you are looking at shadow spaces, meaning the things that, like, that are icky, parts of you don't like, the parts that you don't want to look at, there is gold there. When you start to dig around in there, there's healing that can happen, that can influence and help you open up, shine brighter, be bigger, shift your habits. Like, there's so much ripple effect that will happen when you actually look at the stuff you don't want to look at. Like, when you turn, they talk about shadow work because it's your shadows behind you. When you turn and you look at your shadow and you look at it, it loses that power. And so that's some of the work that Kelly's offering. So the link is right below here. Jump in. Don't be afraid.
Yeah, there's so much waiting, really, like you're so precious. Like, everyone is so precious. And the opportunity to, like, be alive is such a beautiful thing, and it can also be a hell. So I feel like this has been a piece of the work that for me has kind of, like, there's no assurance, right? There's no, like, insurance policy, but it has definitely opened the door to a life that feels precious.
I love it.
I want that for
grab the gift for your shadow work. Jump on in the Facebook group. Let us know what you experienced. Use the hashtag so we can find you in the group, and cannot wait until see you next week. So thank you so much, Kelly. Appreciate you.
We will.
All right, until next week, everybody, have a good one.